Flintstones, meet the Flintstones, they're the modern Stone Age family.
The company was coming off a huge success in 1958 with the show The Huckleberry Hound Show, that featured a blue hound dog from the US that had a different job in almost every episode. After the debut of the show, Hanna-Barbera were surprised to learn that over 40% of the series' audience were actually adults instead of children. After the debut of the show, it garnered so much attention that at the time there were even Huckleberry Hound happy hours in bars that happened during the airing of the show. It was all of this attention that persuaded the partners into bringing animation into primetime. Now, this is where the Flintstones comes in. So the duo set out to create an original adult-oriented primetime cartoon series, something that was unheard of at the time. Since primetime is usually a full half hour, the task was even harder to pitch since cartoons barely reached 6 to 7 minutes tops. Animators over several weeks were coming up with a unique idea to change the sitcom formula. There were many ideas thrown out for a story based on pilgrims, to hillbillies, to Romans, to Native Americans, but none of them really stuck to them. It wasn't until a heated conversation between the animators that Dan Gordon sketched a small drawing. From this, the animators jumped abroad. The early concepts were worked out. The show would focus on Fred Flagstone, who's an arrogant blue-collar worker for a stone quarry, and his wife Wilma, who was tender-hearted but also stood her ground at the same time. This would all, of course, take place in the town of Bedrock. Now from this, Hanna-Barbera produced a 2-minute test short for The Flagstones that featured Fred and his short friend named Barney Rubble interacting at his backyard pool.
Hiya, Fred.
And what are you made up for?
I'm gonna practice spear fishing.
Oh, you can't lose. You'll either spare them or they'll die laughing. How does it work? And don't point that thing at me. It's loaded.
Oops.
Once the show was ready to be pitched in early 1960, Joe Barbera took this short with 2 storyboards to New York City and pitched the show nonstop for 8 weeks straight to as many networks and sponsors that would at least listen. After constant rejection and considering to throw the concept away forever, Barbera's last chance were executives from ABC. Now ABC at this time, they were at an all-time low due to their competitors NBC and CBS. So ABC at this point was willing to take any idea and take a shot in the dark with it. Before greenlighting the actual series debut of The Flagstones, the development of the series was held back when copyright lawyers advised the company that the name Flagstone was way too close to the name Flagstone, which was the last name of the characters from the comic strip High and Lois. After name changes such as Gladstones, it eventually morphed into what we know today as the Flintstones. The show finally debuted on September 30th, 1960 at 8:30 p.m. as part of ABC's Friday night lineup. At this point in the company's history, all of the shows were critical successes leading up to the Flintstones. But believe it or not, the Flintstones was not well received by critics. The critics simply hated the show with the comments such as "an ink disaster" by New York Times' writer Jack Gold, and more critics trashing the laugh track. What saved the show was the positive reaction from audiences that felt like it was a change of pace in the primetime landscape. It was something new. Nobody had ever really seen this before. As the show progressed with 6 seasons until the run was over in 1966, it was critically acclaimed by everyone, even the critics who hated it in the beginning. In its 166 episode run, The Flintstones has not just become an iconic cartoon, but as well as an iconic part of television history. But this wasn't the only cartoon that was actually iconic.
Yogi Bear was the next most popular Hanna-Barbera cartoon to debut in the spotlight. Yogi Bear made his debut in 1958 as a supporting character on the Huckleberry Hound Show. He was the first breakout character from Hanna-Barbera and was eventually more popular than the Huckleberry Hound himself. In January of 1961, he was even given his own show, The Yogi Bear Show, which was sponsored by Kellogg's. One of the most distinctive and innovative characteristics of Yogi Bear was that he was one of several Hanna-Barbera characters to have a collar. This allowed the animators to keep his body static, redrawing only his head in each frame when he spoke. This method of animation reduced the number of drawings needed for a 7-minute cartoon from around 14,000 to around 2,000. Many of Yogi's personality characteristics and mannerisms were based on a popular celebrity of the time as well. Art Carney's Ed Norton character on The Honeymooners was said to be Yogi's inspiration. Many of his voice mannerisms broadly mimic Carney as Norton. Norton, in turn, was influenced from many comedians from the vaudeville era. Yogi Bear's name was also similar to that of contemporary baseball star Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra originally intended to sue Hanna-Barbera Productions for defamation of character, but he eventually dropped the lawsuit. While Hanna-Barbera insisted that there was no connection between their smarter-than-average bear and the baseball player, it's very difficult to believe that there was not at least inspiration, as they were both widely popular household names at the time. Plots of many of the episodes of Yogi Bear centered around Yogi and his best friend Boo Boo Bear and their antics in Jellystone Park, which was obviously a variant of Yellowstone Park. His legacy includes many of his famous catchphrases like,
"Hello, picnic basket."
and his favorite self-promotion,
I'm smarter than the average ranger.
From the time of his character's debut until 1988, Yogi Bear was voiced by Dawes Butler. After Butler's death in '88, Greg Burson stepped in to perform the role, who was actually personally taught by Butler how to perform Yogi and several other characters. According to Christopher P. Lehman, he considered one of the original concepts of the Yogi Bear show to contain political symbolism relative to its era of production. During the late 1950s and 60s, racial segregation in the United States was still very legally enforced. People were confined to living in their designated social place, and attempts to venture outside it came with serious consequences. Yogi has a certain social place as he is restricted to spending his entire life in Jellystone Park under an overseer in the form of a white park ranger. Yogi is compared to many of the activists of the civil rights movement as he wanted to move beyond his designated place and integrate into wider society.
Meet George Jetson.
The Jetsons first aired on September 23, 1962, and ran every Sunday at primetime for one season of 24 episodes. The Jetson family, as told in the theme song, consisted of George, Jane, Judy, and Elroy. They also have a dog named Astro, and later would have a maid named Rosie. The Jetsons were presented as a nuclear family, holding many of the values of many families of the time, and could also be considered the traditional sitcom family. George was the befuddled father, Jane was the housewife that cooked and cleaned with the help of the technology as well at the time. Judy was the boy-crazy teenage daughter, and Elroy was the genius son. The show followed many of the sitcom formulas of the time, including a laugh track, and following themes of and messages seen in many other shows, such as George's hard-headed boss that is always on George for lazing around and work, as well as school troubles and situations concerning Judy or Elroy. Many sound effects used in the show would be heard in other shows that the company would produce later in the future. And Astro, the family dog, sounds similar to another famous dog that Hanna-Barbera would later create.
Wrangler?
The Jetsons is filled with many inventions and technologies that have found their way into our lives in our lifetime. While we may not have flying cars yet, there are others technologies such as video conferencing shown in the Jetsons that we have in our time, such as Skype or FaceTime. Other technologies as well that have made our lives are the Roomba that moves its way in cleaning the floors, and as well as walkways that are mostly seen in airports. While our technologies may not be perfected or non-existent from that of the Jetsons World, the influence and imagination from that technology is still relevant. With just one season, Hanna-Barbera was still able to create a primetime futuristic show that was popular with families, would later be rerun in the same era, and would even have a reboot in the 80s.
In 1968, after a few years of lull for Hanna-Barbera, with some shows hit or miss and not very many that were as popular as the ones that came before, Fred Silverman, who was an executive in charge of children's programming for the CBS network, was looking for a show that revitalized his Saturday morning lineup and pleased the intense watchdog groups at the same time. After the creation of the Archie show based off the comic book, Silverman contacted William Hanna and Joseph Barbera to create another show based around a teenage rock group, but with an extra element. They would solve mysteries in between their gigs. The original title for the show was Mysteries 5 and featured 5 teens, Jeff, Mike, Kelly, Linda, and Linda's brother WW, and their dog named Too Much. They would go solve supernatural mysteries in between their gigs as a rock band. Jeff and Mike were eventually merged into one character named Fred, and Kelly was renamed to Daphne, Linda was now called Velma, and Shaggy, who was no longer WW, was no longer Linda's brother. The original show was titled Who's Scared and was presented to the CBS executives as the centerpiece for that season's Saturday morning cartoon block. The executives felt, however, that the artwork and animation was too frightening for children and decided to pass. Silverman then turned back to the show's original creators, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who reworked it to make it more comedic and less frightening. They dropped the rock band element and focused more on Shaggy and Too Much.
Like next time, signal.
However, after hearing Frank Sinatra's interpretation of Burt Kaempfert's song Strangers in the Night, Silverman was inspired by Sinatra's ad-libbed Doobie Doobie Doo at the end of the song and chose to rename the dog Scooby-Doo, who was then approved for production by the CBS executives. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Debuted on the CBS network on Saturday, September 13th, 1969, with its first episode, What a Night for a Night. Many reboots and many series later, Scooby-Doo continues to be a household name and is one of the most beloved characters of all time. Once many of Hanna-Barbera's original shows were off the air or losing their steam, this character was the one to revitalize the entire company and bring it to success through the 1970s and beyond.
Hanna-Barbera has had rich and iconic cartoon shows that have had a strong impact worldwide. Everything from the unique catchphrases to the comical characters and everything in between. All in all, the 1960s was the era that put Hanna-Barbera on the map in television and animation.